Good afternoon. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here today for this session on African politics, African security, and African economics with the two foremost policymakers from the U.S. government in this area over recent years. We all know that the images and the stories that we get in the daily papers from Africa tend to be depressing, sometimes at best, and despairing at worst. The news from the Central African Republic, from the Congo, it can be all too much to bear at times, but that is only part of the African reality. There are many other realities too. In fact, there's a certain amount of folly in having any hour-and-a-half session just devoted to Africa. But we're also talking about a continent that has 40 or 50% of the fastest growing economies in the world, a continent that has seen some significant successes in terms of not only economics, but politics and democratization, and that has seen its own importance in the world rise considerably. To my right, we have Ambassador Johnnie Carson, who has had really one of the most, who has distinguished himself, I should say, as one of the foremost Africanists, not just of his generation, but of his era. He was most recently Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs for 5 years, which is an enormous achievement in its own right of stamina and courage and engagement. And I remember coming into the office with great regularity and finding out that Johnnie was in another place that I couldn't find on the map sometimes, and I certainly couldn't imagine traveling to. And he was just an absolutely indefatigable statesman and diplomat. In the course of his career, he held 3 embassies, which is quite unusual these days. I think I've got them all right. Uganda, Zimbabwe, Kenya. All critical posts. And he also served, as we say in Washington, on the other side of the river. He was the National Intelligence Officer for Africa and had a number of other really important positions during an illustrious career. And he has honors and accolades as long as your arm, and I won't begin to recite them all. He is now a consultant, or a senior advisor, I should say, at the U.S. Institute of Peace. To my left is my good friend General Carter Ham, who is here at Dartmouth for 2 weeks, I'm delighted to say. He was the second combatant commander at the U.S. Africa Command, and also went to an astonishing number of countries in the course of his tenure there. I think 43, you told me the other day. Is that correct? 42. It goes up and down every day, but that depends more on whether countries are still there.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's true.
And he also had a remarkable career. He began unusually in this day and age of political generals, which I would never call you. He started as an infantryman and then was commissioned an officer after ROTC at John Carroll University in his hometown of Cleveland. He was commander of the U.S. Army in Europe. He was director of operations at the Joint Staff and had many, many other positions of tremendous responsibility in the U.S. military. I had the good fortune to work with both of these gentlemen extensively because, as you all know, terrorism is an increasing problem in Africa, and this was a period of great turmoil, but I found them to be extraordinarily good colleagues, and I learned an enormous amount from them. And one of the things that I learned from both of them is that the days when you could ignore anything that went on in Africa have long since passed. Johnnie, you're probably familiar with this old Kissinger story where he was asked if he'd ever had a principals committee meeting, a committee meeting that is a meeting of the president's national security cabinet on Africa, and he replied indignantly, "Not on my watch." those days are long past, and we had many, many deputies and principals committee meetings on Africa. What goes on in Africa critically affects our security and our economy and our position in the world. So I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Carson and General Ham here today. I can't think of anyone better to speak on the key issues facing Africa. They're both going to speak for about 10 minutes with introductory statements, and then we'll have a conversation up here, and then we'll open it up for questions from the floor. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Johnnie Carson.
Dan, thank you very, very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you at Dartmouth, and it's a great pleasure to be with General Carter Ham. And indeed, you are right. This is the first time that we have been out in public together talking, although we have traveled around Africa a great deal, and we have sat in on many of the deputies and principals meetings in Washington and by VTC together. So it's a pleasure to be with both of you, and Dan as well. You've been a part of many of these discussions. Let me take about 10 or 12 minutes to say a bit about Africa, which I think is largely misunderstood or ignored in many parts of the United States, and lay out where I think things are going right and where things perhaps are not going well. Talk about some of the challenges. But before I jump into this, I would be remiss to not acknowledge that there are several former U.S. ambassadors in this audience. Tom Hull from Sierra Leone is one of our distinguished ambassadors, and lest I give away anyone's age, I'm going to say that Roland Kushu, who's sitting here in the front row, was one of my bosses at my very first Foreign Service post. And I think probably it was at that post that I learned a great deal about what I spent the next 40 years doing. It was the Nigerian Civil War that consumed us all at that time, Roland, and we saw a great deal going on. But it's good to be with you. Africa is an enormously large and complex place. 1 billion people in 54 different African states, living in a continent that is 2.5 times the size of the United States. Africa is a dynamic and diverse place, and it is changing every day very rapidly. Many of the ways that Americans see the continent are caught up in old stereotypes, reinforced by graphic photographs and very glaring and disturbing headlines. They portray a continent that is full of violence, in disarray, and falling apart. Africa is far too large, too complex, too dynamic, and too diverse to be summed up by one headline or one photograph. To understand what is happening today in Africa, one has to look at thousands of pictures and read hundreds and hundreds of lines to understand what indeed is going on. It is only by looking at these many pictures and reading those many words, both good and bad, and thinking of Africa as a motion picture, that you'll understand what is happening. Beyond and despite the current headlines of violence in the Central African Republic, conflict in South Sudan, terrorism in northern Nigeria, and the presence of UN and African peacekeepers in at least 6 different African countries. Despite all of these things, Africa is increasingly a good news story. Let me say that again. Africa is increasingly a good news story. But we all know good news does not sell newspapers, and good news doesn't make for good headlines. Let's see what we've got. While the poverty and conflict and political turmoil continue to challenge various parts of Africa, Africa has made some strides, some very serious and significant strides in the last 50 years of the continent's independence for the majority of African states. First of all, democracy is on the move and on the march across the continent. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union 2 years later in 1991, Africa has continued to progressively democratize. Freedom House, many of you know it. Freedom House in 1973, when it started listing countries that were free, partially free, not free at all, listed 3 African states in 1973 as free, and probably a half a dozen others listed as partially free. Today, over 30 states in Africa are listed by Freedom House as being free or partly free. And that is an enormous amount of progress. There is progress, and we can talk about it in greater details, but that's just one example of where things are going. Economic prospects, as Dan mentioned, are starting to take an upward trajectory. 18 months ago, the World Bank and the IMF said that 6 of the 10 fastest growing countries in the world were in Africa, and that 10 of the 20 fastest growing countries could be found on the continent. A great deal has happened to change this. Once upon a time, one looked at Africa and said you would find economic growth in those countries that were producing oil and gas and minerals. But the economic growth that we've seen in recent years, over the last decade and a half, have come from other sources. They've come from increased urbanization, the rapid rise of a middle class, the use of digital and wireless technology, economic reforms that have been driven by political reforms, and new foreign and domestic investment coming in. That's a reality. And again, we see these changes occurring. Looking at the democratic side and the economic side, if you were to ask any leader in Africa today whether he was a Democrat and supported democracy or not, every one of them would say they support democracy. There's no one talking about being a socialist. There's no one talking about one-party rule. And no one is talking about command economies that were very common a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades ago. Increasingly, and this is a little bit hard to take when you look at the newspapers and deal with the things we have to deal with, but increasingly, conflict and violence in Africa is going down, not up. No doubt that we have some very serious issues out there, and both General Ham and I will probably get an opportunity to talk about them. But why would I make an assertion that violence is going down? Let me just remind everyone not to look at the headline or the photograph, but think about the entire motion picture. The very violent and bloody and nasty Nigerian civil war that Roland Kushel and I lived through in Nigeria is not there. But also remember Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa, all conflicts that were violent are now off the table. Think about the very bloody conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea, a World War I style conflict along that country's border. No longer. Yes, we do have residual conflicts on the continent, and some are a result of a new challenge and a new threat. But if you look back, there is, in fact, resolution of some of the more difficult conflicts. And the violent level has, in fact, diminished because we don't have the conflicts in Southern Africa. We don't have Ethiopia, Eritrea. We don't have Liberia and Sierra Leone. All things that were grabbing as many headlines as issues today. And some of the ones we're dealing with today are residual from 20 or 30 years ago. Violence in the Congo, the Eastern Congo. We forget dramatically that the UN just didn't go into the Congo 4 or 5 years ago. It went into the Congo approximately 9 months after that country's independence in 1960. And that the only Secretary General that we've ever lost died trying to resolve the Congo crisis, Dag Hammarskjöld. That's a legacy crisis. A legacy crisis. So don't look at the headlines. Look far deeper. I don't want to leave anyone here with a distorted picture of Africa being a place where everything is going right and that there are no future clouds or storms on the horizon. Indeed, there are. Africa today faces seven challenges, all of which could derail the progress that we've seen over the last 2 decades. What are these 7? And I'll be very quick because we could talk about all these issues in a great deal of depth. The first is rapid population growth. Africa's population is growing today at approximately 2.3% per annum. This means that Africa's population will double in approximately 31 or 32 years. By 2015, 25% of the world's population will live in Africa. 1 out of every 4 individuals in the global community will be an African. Just think of the enormous strain that this will put on African governments to build houses, to build schools, to build medical facilities, to find jobs, and for us to deal with issues related to immigration. This is a real issue. We can come back to the population issue, but it is one of those challenges. The second one is climate change. Dan mention that I worked for a while across the river and up the river. About 7 years ago, that organization, the National Intelligence Council, presented a national intelligence estimate on the issue of climate change. How will countries and nations be impacted by climate change? Key judgment on Africa was this, and this is not classified. Key judgment, Africa is probably one of the most vulnerable continents in the world and probably is one least prepared to deal with it. Get a map out and look at how many African capitals sit on seacoasts. We all know that as global warming continues, seas rise, and places that are located next to them will be inundated by water. Areas that have been drought prone will have enormous flooding, and those that are known for good agricultural lands will experience enormous periods of dryness. These things are already happening, and if you look at the headlines, you will see it's not just the snow caps disappearing from Mount Kenya or Mount Kilimanjaro or the warming of the Ruwenzori or the decrease in the lake sizes of Lake Victoria. These things are out there, but they don't get the kind of attention and priority that they should, because issues of civil conflict, of economic development, all dominate. Third one is terrorism, and I think that General Ham will probably talk to this a great deal more. Africa has not been inoculated against regional or global terrorism or the emergence of radical religious groups. In 1998, the embassies of the United States in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam were attacked and destroyed by Al-Qaeda East Africa. That event occurred 3 years before 9/11 and was, in fact, a precursor to 9/11. Simultaneous attacks against 2 embassies, 2 targets, suicide bombers, well coordinated and orchestrated. Since then, we have seen the emergence of terrorism both linked globally and some regionally occur in Somalia, Mali, Sahel, as places, and in northern Nigeria with Boko Haram. Let me say that the other challenges are narco-trafficking, a major issue out there for Africa, corruption, particularly in large states like Nigeria and Angola, which have large amounts of money being generated by oil. And finally, the last 2, the need to continue to consolidate democracy and strengthen democratic institutions, as well as to build on the economic growth that's occurring. All 7 of these things remain challenges, and they remain serious challenges if the continent is going to continue to make progress. As I said, it is a large, dynamic, and complex place, 54 countries. It's hard to capture that much in one snapshot or in one headline. Thank you.
General Ham.
Well, it's probably bad form to critique the moderator, but I shall. Ambassador Benjamin introduced us as 2 foremost policymakers. I would remind him that those of us who served in the militaries were not policymakers. He's the policymaker. So if you don't like the policy, ask Johnny. Right? But it was a great privilege for me to have the opportunity to serve with both of these gentlemen. I am not an Africanist. No one was more surprised than I was when then Secretary Gates turned to me one day and said, "Carter, I'm going to recommend to the President that he nominates you to be the next commander of Africa Command." I was elated and terrified simultaneously because it was a great job. It was very exciting. It was intriguing. And I knew nothing about Africa. So I started to learn and I started to read. And one of the things I learned is that the first place you go when you want to learn about Africa in the United States government is Ambassador Johnnie Carson. And over the time that I served at Africa Command, Ambassador Carson was the source that I would go to when it was a particularly complex issue, as all of them seem to be, and to say, "Johnnie, how did we get here? How did this situation develop and unfold?" And he knew the history, he knew the players, he knew the participants. He had personal knowledge and experience in almost every one of these. And that was invaluable to me as I tried to craft a military campaign that would match what it was that our nation was trying to achieve in Africa. We didn't always agree, and that's probably a good thing. There's some goodness in the tension, but we always had the same goal in mind, and that was, what are the things that we should do that are in the best interests of the people of the United States of America in advancing our goals? The same was very true with my interaction with Ambassador Benjamin, as we sat in many counterterrorist fora and discussing a wide variety of issues, and again, increasingly complex. He had to deal with the whole globe. I only had to deal with one part of the world, though, as you've heard from Ambassador Carson, certainly a dangerous one. But what's always struck me about Ambassador Benjamin is that he was the one that would keep in these fora where everyone seemed to be mostly focused on, frankly, on tactical and operational issues. Ambassador Benjamin was the one that said, "Yeah, but what are we doing to address the underlying issues that are creating the conditions that allow extremism to take hold?" Sometimes more successfully than others. And I suspect we can talk about that. As a newcomer to Africa, I quickly turned, as military guys tend to do, and say, what are the source documents? What are the things that tell us what we're supposed to do? And I learned about a presidential policy directive that the president outlines 4 principal pillars that guide U.S. policy in Africa. And Ambassador Carson has touched on most of these. The first, strengthen democratic institutions, helping African governments become accountable, transparent, and responsive, bolster positive models, and promote human rights. Second pillar, spur economic growth, trade, and investment. And the president, I think, in his last trip to Africa last summer, certainly emphasized that. The third pillar was advance peace and security, and not surprisingly, that's the pillar on which we at United States Africa Command focus the most, with specific emphasis on countering terrorism, building regional security cooperation, security sector reform, and the prevention of conflict and mass atrocities across the continent. And then the fourth pillar of the president's policy, promote opportunity and development, and there is a supporting military role in that, I believe. The second document is the National Military Strategy, which says that for the United States Armed Forces in Africa, we should focus on building partner capacity, focusing on counter-extremism, and assisting, interestingly, and this is several years ago, assisting the African Union, particularly in the African Union's development of its African standby forces. And then finally, a defense strategic guidance in which the President and the Secretary of Defense outlined the principal missions of the armed forces. And again, for Africa, they tell us to apply a light footprint, low cost, and innovative approaches. that was code to me that says, you're not going to get much to do what we told you to do in Africa. And that was pretty much true. With all of that, then we crafted a mission at United States Africa Command that was focused on strengthening, that was the primary mission, strengthening the defense capabilities of African militaries so that they were increasingly capable of providing for their own defense and for contributing to regional security. Now, certainly, as all military commands, we had to be prepared to conduct combat operations when so directed by the President. Libya is an example of that, but that was, frankly, more of an anomaly for Africa Command than the norm. The President, in his first trip to Africa, when he spoke in Accra, Ghana in 2009, vocalized a principle I think that most of us who have worked in Africa believe very strongly in, and that's the simple statement of African solutions to African challenges. Let me give you 3 examples where Africa Command tried to abide by that principle over the past few years. The first is Somalia. It's hard sometimes to think of Somalia in any kind of positive light, but I think, as Ambassador Carson artfully laid out, things are changing. He and I had opportunity to visit, and it's a different Somalia than most Americans have in their minds. It's different in part because the African Union, and particularly the African nations of the region, have decided to make it different. And they have taken a decision that they would counter the extremism espoused by Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda affiliate, and African forces, notably Ethiopia, Uganda, Burundi, Kenya, now Sierra Leone and Djibouti, have deployed forces who have fought very bravely and quite effectively in Somalia. They've done so with the considerable financial support from the United States and others, but also with the training and equipping that has been provided by the United States under the authorities that the Department of State has, and Africa Command was glad to partner in some of that effort. But I think that's as I would talk with people in the Department of Defense, that's a good model of what building partner capacity is. It's enabling African forces to accomplish the missions that they want to accomplish. It so happens that their objectives align with ours, and that's a good thing. But a light footprint, a little bit of intelligence support, some money and some equipping and training, I think, is a good model. A second example is in the effort to bring to justice Joseph Kony and those in the Lord's Resistance Army. And those of you, I suspect most of you in this room know about the Lord's Resistance Army. I would tell audience, particularly student audiences who sometimes didn't know about that, said if you ever questioned if there was really evil in this world, just Google Joseph Kony, and that will eliminate any doubt in your mind that evil exists in this world. Again, an African-led effort, principally by the Ugandans, but in partnership with South Sudan, Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The United States Congress passed a law, and President Obama gave us a directive to assist the African forces in that effort, and so a small number of United States Special Operations personnel, about 100, operate in the region. Again, it's not U.S. personnel out tracking and patrolling and hunting down Kony. It's doing the things that we do best. We provide intelligence support, long-range communications, medical support, logistics, and that kind of capability that enhances the inherent capabilities of the African forces. A third way in which Africa Command has assisted Africans is in maritime security in the Gulf of Guinea. Rising maritime insecurity in the Gulf of Guinea threatens the economic growth. It's a growing problem. There's been limited capacity of the naval and coastal forces of the African countries in the Gulf, and they haven't had mechanisms to share maritime intelligence and maritime domain awareness. And we are very happy to partner with them, both in terms of equipping and tactical training, but perhaps more importantly, on helping them craft the kinds of arrangements and cooperative agreements that allow, for example, hot pursuit in waters between the nations. And in the Gulf of Guinea, as many of you know, it crosses not only multiple countries, but two of African Union's regional economic communities, the economic community of West African states and also of Central African states. And so we think, at least from our African Union people tell us, for the first time, two regional economic communities have crafted a mutual agreement that addresses maritime security, and we are very happy to be a small part of that. Now, there's a sense that the United States military is out there doing these things all by itself, but that's not at all true. Everything that we did was done in partnership with others in the U.S. government, and most importantly, with the approval and the consent of the United States ambassadors, several of whom are here. As Ambassador Benjamin mentioned, I got to 42 of the 54 countries. I think you got to all of them. But one thing was always clear to me, that though I ended up being a fairly high-ranking military officer, wherever I was never the senior American in any African country. It was always the United States ambassador. And again, we didn't always agree. We might bark at each other behind closed doors, but when we walked out of those doors, we were arm in arm, unified in implementing U.S. policy. So that, I think, is a snapshot of what we tried to do. It was a far-ranging, diverse, and complex mission. When I left Africa Command late last spring, it dawned on me that I was at the point where I was just beginning to understand how much I didn't know about Africa. And I suppose those who have studied Africa for a lifelong experience still have much to learn. The one thing I did learn, of which I'm quite certain, is that about Africa's most valuable resource. It's not diamonds or uranium or other minerals. It's not oil or natural gas. It is Africa's people. That is the treasure. That is the natural resource. And that is where I believe we should focus our efforts as we move forward to accomplish our nation's objectives on that great and vast continent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And let me just say for the record, I have never heard Carter Ham bark. But the two of you have, I think, laid out a compelling case that a lot of things are getting better, and in some cases they're getting better when the United States plays an important role, but plays a role that, Johnnie, you've often described as either leading from the side or leading from behind, and really ensuring that it is the people who live in these places who are designing solutions and who are integrally involved. My own instinct from working on security issues in this region is that there's a lot more we could do, and I'm curious, and we'll start with you, Johnnie, where else you would like to see the U.S. take this kind of approach, or maybe we've taken it and we need to take it more robustly. What other key challenges in Africa might we tackle using this sort of capacity building, intelligence, leadership combination, and equally important, what do we do to convince the Congress that this is really in our interest?
No, it's a very good point. And I think that General Ham has rightly pointed out a number of places where we have been extraordinarily good and effective partners with Africa. Somalia being one of those cases, LRA another of those cases. But I think that we can also be effective partners in working with Africans to deal with some of the challenges that I talked about earlier, particularly in the area of energy. Africa has enormous energy assets in hydroelectric potential and solar potential, the use of coal and other old resources. But it does need a partnership to be able to effectively exploit those resources, turn them into energy that people can use. And so we've got to look for ways to partner. I think one of the things that President Obama did on his trip last July in Africa was to announce a major Power Africa initiative where he committed to working with the private sector in this country and with African private sector to substantially increase the amount of electricity going into African households. We have to find ways to effectively work in collaboration and in partnership. And as we move away from the security theater, we have to find ways of encouraging the American business and investment community to recognize the growing importance of Africa as a trading partner and as a place for investment. All of these things require a great deal of support, encouragement, and collaboration from our side, saying it's important to do it. Equally, I think it's important for us to work on dealing with issues of narco trafficking. That's a global issue. It's not just an African issue. It's not just our issue. And we need to find ways to help strengthen African customs services, help them to improve their border security, help them to improve their ability to inspect and interdict cargoes that may be carrying narcotics. So there are lots of ways that we can, in effect, work with the Africans nations, and we just have to be more assertive about doing it.
Sure. There are a couple of areas I think certainly we could improve upon, though there has been already significant improvement. One of those is Congress has granted over the past few years what are called dual key authorities, that programs that can be implemented if both the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State agree with them. I like that approach a lot. I think there's more of that we can do. Most of it right now is focused in the area of counterterrorism. I think it could go into other areas. As I traveled around Africa, the one thing that African security officials, both civilian and military, asked me for more than anything else was intelligence. They were very good with human intelligence, better than we'll ever be in the African continent. Obviously, they have culture and language and all of those other skills, but they're not quite as good in technical intelligence as the United States has. And so I think we can make some improvements in expediting the process by which we share intelligence with non-traditional partners. So I think that's an area to improve. We ought to streamline our security assistance programs. Again, I would talk with African leaders. I said, the only two guarantees I can make you if you're interested in procuring U.S. military hardware is that it will take much longer than you expect, and it will cost a lot more than you're willing to spend. And that proved to be the case, and I think we lost opportunities, and we lost some ability to provide needed equipment to partners. Most African countries, at least in my experience, would like the United States to be their security partner of choice. We make it awfully difficult for them. Lastly, given my interest, I think, in emphasis on human development in the military domain, we ought open more opportunities for professional military education, more Africans coming to the United States, and more American officers and non-commissioned officers going to professional military education in African programs. I think that would benefit all of us.
Johnnie, as I was looking, Googling the other day just to think about this event, I came across a headline from last October that you can see that spoke about a prize that has been endowed by Mo Ibrahim, the Sudanese-born telecommunications billionaire. And this goes to the issue of leadership and governance. And it says, I guess, for the fourth time in 5 years since this prize was created, it was not awarded for the best for good governance prize to African leaders. And I was wondering if you think that that is a fair conclusion, and if so, what is it that is hindering the emergence of a new generation of African leaders? And I should note that just such a short period of time after the passing of Nelson Mandela, this is, of course, a critical question for everyone, whether they're African or not.
Now, let me just say that Mo Ibrahim has done a great thing by establishing this prize for democracy and good governance, and he has set a very high standard for it. I think that there is a leadership deficit in Africa today. While there are a number of outstanding leaders over the last 3 or 4 years, none of those leaders who might have been eligible for the prize had comported themselves in office at a sufficiently high standard to be worthy of receiving it. I think there are a number of younger African leaders across the continent who may, in fact, in the future, be eligible for this prize. And I think some of those leaders should be recognized in the future. You ask quite possibly who some of these leaders might be. Right away, I would say someone like the new president of Senegal, Macky Sall, who was voted into office and replaced a sitting president. I think across the continent we have two very good women presidents in Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia, who has led her country out of a catastrophic economic crisis and a civil war. The same thing can be said of the leadership being displayed these days by Joyce Banda in Malawi. Very, very courageous work. But there are good leaders out there. They just haven't left office at this juncture. But whether it's the leader of Botswana, Ian Khama, or whether it's the leader of Tanzania, President Kikwete, they are out there. It's just that some of the leaders who've left in recent years have not been worthy of the prize.
Carter, I just wanted to ask you, one of the areas in which I think the U.S. government has innovated a bit in the last few years was in terms of building bonds between different African countries for common goals. And we found, I know you and I both found that, for example, in dealing with counterterrorism issues in the Maghreb and the Sahel, that we could, for example, bring together Mauritanians, Moroccans, Algerians, Malians, and the like in a way that perhaps they hadn't always come together before. And I'm wondering if you think that this is another growth area for the United States and something we ought to be trying to do more of, and not just reacting when the crises become really acute.
I think it most certainly is a growth area and an area that more and more African leaders, military and civilian, are recognizing that they need to put emphasis on it. I recall in the immediate aftermath of the military coup in Mali, Ambassador Carson and I were afforded the opportunity to attend a meeting of the Economic Community of West African States as their leadership was deciding what to do about that. And one of the impediments was the absence of a credible African standby force that could respond quickly in emergencies like this. And I think that moment kind of crystallized in the minds of those leaders that was something that they needed to develop. And I think that's been very much the case across the continent. As you mentioned, particularly the four countries of Algeria, Mauritania, Mali, and Niger, cooperating before the coup occurred in Mali, had already established a coordinating center in the southern part of Algeria to synchronize their efforts on the borders and to deal with the common threat of Al-Qaeda in the lands of the Islamic Maghreb and other extremist organizations. I think following the coup, that coordinating center took on a more operational flavor, and I think that's a very good thing. And I think there are some ways in which the United States can facilitate that. Again, in the areas where we have some capabilities that other nations don't possess in the area of long-range communications, intelligence, and the like. So I think that is an area, a growth area, and more nations are realizing that the threats that present themselves in Africa are regional, transnational threats, and it takes a regional or transnational approach to counter those threats effectively.
I want to turn it over to the audience, but in 1 second. I have one last question for you, Johnnie, and that is the issue of economics in Africa is always an important one, and lately it's been a particularly fascinating one. On the one hand, we live in a period in which investors are looking for markets in which there will be significant payoffs, and emerging markets have been identified as such, and so there's been a lot of money flowing in that way. On the other hand, we never seem to do as well as we could in terms of opening our own markets to Africa and African goods. And where on the dial do you think we are right now, and how much is Africa benefiting from its economic relationship with the United States?
Let me say just two things. One is that there is growth in African economies. American companies have been engaged at a particular level across Africa, but it's generally been in the oil and gas and minerals sectors. It's the extractive industries. American oil companies are big players across the continent, whether it's in the established markets in Angola and Nigeria, whether it's the newer markets that are opening up in Tanzania and Mozambique. American companies have also done extraordinarily well in selling capital equipment across Africa. Boeing does as much business in Africa today as it does in Russia and the old Soviet Union. If you fly the big airlines in Africa, East African, Ethiopian, Air Morocco, Air Egypt, you're likely to be flying on a Boeing aircraft. And South Africa is 50-50. So we've done well there. General Electric in selling diesel, locomotives, generators, all the big capital equipment. Where we have not done well and where we need to continue to push American business is to the larger consumer markets, into selling medical equipment, into going in and building and rehabilitating ports and railroads, selling technical equipment, getting in on the telecoms revolution that we've largely lost out on. There are more cell phone users in Africa than there are in the United States. There are more Africans using their cell phones to carry out financial transactions than Americans do, but we've not been engaged there. We don't see AT&T and Verizon and others out there in the marketplace. We need to encourage these kinds of operators to get out there. To compete not only with our traditional competitors, the British and the French and the Europeans, but also the new competitors in Africa, Turkey, China, India, and Brazil. We must not stand back and concede the African marketplace to them. As I said earlier, We're looking at a continent of 1 billion people right now, and by 2050, we will be looking at a continent that has 25% of the world's population, and we'll be spending a lot on economic activities. On the other side of the table, the one thing that we have been good at is opening U.S. markets to Africa. One of the programs that we established under the Clinton administration was something called the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, A-G-O-A. And under AGOA, which has to be renewed in 2015, African countries, if they are AGOA eligible, are allowed to import into the United States duty-free some 6,000 different commodities. Most of the things that have come into the United States under AGOA have been textiles. This has been a major source of imports, but also we are seeing from Ethiopia things like leather products and shoes coming into the marketplace. Some countries, I'll mention South Africa in particular, has used AGOA to import into the United States automobiles. If any of you are driving a 300 series BMW or a 300 series Mercedes and think that it is coming from Germany, in fact, it's coming from South Africa, because those cars are manufactured in South Africa by Mercedes and BMW, and then shipped into the United States under AGOA. So South Africa has been a country which has used AGOA quite effectively. Many other African countries do not have the kind of industrial base to allow them to participate more fully in these economic activities. But we do have something called AGOA, and it does allow for, as I say, approximately 5,000 to 6,000 products manufactured in Africa to come into the United States duty-free.
And here I was sure those cars were made in South Carolina and Alabama. Okay, at this point, let's open up the conversation to the audience. There should be microphones going around. And please don't ask your question until you do have a microphone. And then when you do ask your question, make sure that it has a question mark at the end of it. And we would also appreciate if you'd identify yourself. So, right there.
Hi, I'm Pete Mertz, just a Hanover resident. And Ambassador Carson gave me an opening because he mentioned Liberia twice, and it's a country in which I have a lot of interest. And I would contend that U.S. policy there has had a very poor history, from our support of the Americo-Liberian elite to our blessing of Samuel Doe's election to our failure to get involved at all in the devastating Civil War. And now we have a country that ranks in the top 5 in the world in terms of lowest per capita income and corruption. We recently had no student pass the entrance exam for the University of Liberia at the first sitting. The capital's without electricity. How much responsibility do you see the U.S. as having, given our historical relationship in Liberia, for this failure, and what can be done about it?
Okay, good, a very good question. Let me say that the responsibility for Liberia's history as well as Liberia's future rests not with people in Washington and the United States, but with the people of Liberia and with its leaders, first and foremost. And so I think that we should not see ourselves as responsible for Liberia's history, nor should we see ourselves responsible for Liberia's future. What we can do and what we should do is to try to be the most effective partners and counselors that we can in working with Liberia. And we should, in fact, continue to push those things which are in our interests and which we believe are in the interest of Liberia. First and foremost, strong democratic institutions, economic growth and development that provides opportunity for its citizens, helping to them to develop the kind of security forces that will promote stability within a democratic society. Those are important. Let me not attempt to rewrite the history, but to say a little bit about it. A lot of what went on in Africa prior to the end of the Cold War in 1989 and 1991 had everything to do with global politics and the desire to frustrate Russian, Chinese, and communist efforts across the continent. More often than not, we chose our friendships and relationships in Africa based on how people believed their politics aligned with that of Washington in the West or with the Soviet Union. Liberia was in that category. Since the end of the Cold War, I think that our policies in Africa and across Africa have been more reflective of our values and principles and priorities at home. Strong democratic institutions, economic growth and opportunity, respect for civil liberties, free market economic systems, and opportunities for everyone. And I think those are the policies that we seek to advance. Samuel Doe came along during a period in which the Cold War was still flourishing. He was looked at as a Cold War ally and not as a democratic one. His rise to power and his fall was as the result of the barrel of the gun.
Dr. Miller.
Thank you to Dickie and to Ambassador Benjamin for an excellent panel. I'm Norman Miller, a lifelong East Africanist. I have two questions, both of which come out of the African Studies Association, which recently met in Baltimore. The ASA is about 3,000 American and African academic, State Department, missionary folks. It's the association in the United States, and all you gentlemen know that very well, I know. China in Africa was one of the big topics at the ASA this year, and I'd like to get comments about what American thinking, American policy thinking is about the China. China has apparently 1 million or more citizens, most of them traders and business people working in Africa now, but it looks to me as a neo-colonial commodity heist going on. India's a part of it, Brazil's a part of it, but China in Africa is very worrisome to, or for knowledge, for understanding is one thing. The other is the future of African studies in the United States, which of course worries the association. And African Studies is headquartered pretty much at 14 universities who've had over the years enormous grants, National Defense Education Act, for language and for politics and for geography and military anthropology is even a new topic. They're not being funded. The money is diminishing. Money to bring Africans to the major centers is falling away. And the myth at the ASA was that there are more jobs within the intelligence community for Africanists than there are in American universities. So I'd like to get your comments on what's the future of African studies in the United States, and what's the future of China-American-Africa relations?
China?
Sure, I'll start off on China, and it's pretty easy because it's principally not military. There certainly is some military-to-military engagement that China endeavors to achieve in Africa, but it's not much. And they have attachés throughout the world or throughout the continent. The Chinese are beginning to make some contributions to United Nations missions in Africa. I think that's a very positive trend. Our attachés and the U.S. military personnel who do work in Africa have cordial, if not warm, effective relationship, a professional relationship with their Chinese counterpart. But it isn't certainly is not adversarial. There's not much of a competition. Many African countries 20 years or so ago opted to procure Chinese military hardware because it's relatively low cost and they don't have all the hurdles that we have, and the ambassadors here are familiar with end user agreements and all those kinds of requirements that we place on nations if they're going to buy or receive our hardware. The Chinese have no such things. And Africa is today largely littered with interoperable Chinese military hardware. So African countries have found other sources for that. Having said that, I think there are some ways in which we can find common ground in Africa with the military. Two come to mind. In Tanzania, the Chinese, at the request of the Tanzanian National Defense Forces, built a new Tanzanian Defense College, kind of the top level professional military education. They built the facility. They asked us to help them with the programming of that. That's not a bad partnership. In Liberia, the United States ambassador and the Chinese ambassador, working with the Liberian government, have said one of the objectives for the armed forces of Liberia, President Sirleaf wants to have a small engineering capability, much like it was present in many states in the National Guard here at home, for disaster relief, to repair bridges and flooding and deal with things like that. And there's some possibility that the Chinese who have such equipment might be able to provide that under the broader umbrella of the U.S. Training to the armed forces of Liberia.
Let me respond to both the questions. China is in Africa to serve its own national interests. China is not in Africa for altruistic purposes. China has been a player in Africa episodically for many years. But in the last decade and a half, it has substantially stepped up its activities across the continent. It has done that principally for three reasons. One is to gain access to Africa's large oil and gas resources to help propel the enormous economic growth that has gone on in China for the last decade. 11%, I think it is. Secondly, China is in Africa to maintain and secure the one China policy. We don't think of Taiwan too much, but China still does. It is very hostile to the fact that Taiwan continues to have commercial offices and agencies around Africa, and in some instances, diplomatic representation. They squeeze African governments to push them out. And where the Taiwanese do have commercial operations, the Chinese are insistent a lot of times that they not be in the capital city. Thirdly, China is in Africa to secure its own political and diplomatic protection in international fora. It wants and needs those 54 African votes. And it wants and needs them whenever someone says, why are you treating the Dalai Lama the way you're treating him? What are you doing repressing the people of the Muslim people in the region of Urumqi, the Uyghurs? It does not want UN resolutions that favor international intervention on behalf of oppressed peoples. So it wants those African votes. It wants to keep Taiwan at bay, and it wants and needs African oil and energy. So there's a very clear reason that is defined for their judgment. There are probably three others. I won't go into the other three, but those are the top three. But the other thing that is also very clear is that the Chinese do business in Africa in ways that are, quite honestly, unhelpful to Africa. And we see it across the continent. Yes, they bring in investment, but their investment is not transparent. We don't see the nature of the deals that are done for rehabilitation of roads and ports and railroads. We don't see the deals that are done for the construction of housing in Angola and Algeria. We don't see what the barter arrangements are. And we also see the Chinese bringing in hundreds and thousands of workers into Africa to do manual labor jobs. And this is a disadvantage to Africa. We say to the Africans, as we say to the Chinese, to the Africans, drive the same kinds of bargains with the Chinese that you do with an American or Japanese or British or German or French firm. Drive the same kind of hard deals. If you go to Port Harcourt, or if you go to Cabinda or out to Luanda to see the oil rigs, you don't see hundreds and hundreds of American workers out there. We hire local, we provide skills training, we provide technology transfers, we integrate people into our operations, we follow local labor laws, and we also have something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, in which we prosecute people for corrupt practices. I don't know whether you can get this done in a Chinese court. There is a difference, but the reasons are very clear. The second thing I will say about the future of African studies, I think now is the time to not be pulling back, but in fact to be doing more. Because I believe that over the next 5, 10, 20, 25, 30 years, we will continue to see progress in Africa. We will see Africa becoming more urban, more middle class, more educated, and more a part of the economic global community. And if that is happening, it means that we need more people who understand what's happening, just not on a global basis in Africa, but what's happening in Tanzania, what's happening in Nigeria, and places like that. This is extraordinarily important for us, and I think we lose sight of this. Let me just, one quick factoid out there on this, and I'm harping on demographics and things like that. And this is a demographic about Nigeria, Africa's largest country. Depending on who you're looking at, numbers 160 to 170 million people. In that, 2050 scheme of things, where I said that we would see Africa's population rise there, we will see Nigeria's population double. We will see it double. It will become, over the next 70 years, probably one of the largest countries in the world. As Japanese population declines, as the Russian population declines, we're seeing enormous growth still in Nigeria. But don't take it in that, just take it down to a microcosm. And the other factoid is today that Nigeria is, in fact, the 6th largest Muslim country in the world. The 6th largest Muslim country in the world. Soon to be tied with and surpass Egypt, probably in the next decade. And we're talking about a country that has more Muslims than any Arab state in the Middle East. That's why we should be focused.
Let's go right over here.
I guess this is directed at, I'm Paul Pashuka and I'm a student here. I guess this is directed at General Ham. I'm aware that AFRICOM is not based in Africa, and I was wondering how the distance, and you're saying that you have these relationships with African countries, and you're saying that sort of a light footprint in Africa. Do you think this is strategic in the idea that people don't want a large American presence in these countries, or do you think this is sort of a benign neglect of the sector?
Yeah, the location of the headquarters was, I think, more a result of practicality than anything else. Previous to the establishment of United States Africa Command, United States European Command, headquartered in Stuttgart, had responsibility for most of, not all, but most of Africa. And so when the command was stood up, the people were already there, the facilities were there, it kind of made sense. Now, in fairness, there were a number of countries who very strongly objected to not only the existence, the establishment of Africa Command, but also its the potential for basing a large headquarters in Africa. There are also countries that welcomed it, and Ambassador Carson and I both had heads of state say, come move. And I mean, every time Secretary Clinton would go to Africa, someone would tell her, put the headquarters here, and we would go through a drill of why it wasn't a good idea. So now, from a practical sense, would I like the command headquarters to be in Africa? Yes. As a taxpayer, no. The United States military doesn't do things small very well. So you have a headquarters that if you moved it to an African country, you got to build buildings. We don't just build buildings, we build housing, we build schools, we build playgrounds, we build churches, we build grocery stores and swimming pools and all of that. And a rough estimate, frankly, when Secretary Panetta was executing a study directed by the Congress to do this, it's about $1 billion. I don't know about you, but there's probably better ways for our government to spend $1 billion than doing that right now. In practical terms, yes, it was hard. I spent a lot of time in airplanes, and people spend a lot of time in airplanes. But I think that's better than trying to have a large presence on the continent, at least right now. Stuttgart's a good place. We're well treated. Families are well cared for. It's a great commercial airport right nearby, and it's a great location for the command headquarters right now.
I'm Tom Hull, former ambassador to Sierra Leone, former professor of international relations at Simmons College, and currently a consultant on Africa. And my question is on a specific African country that's important to us, and the relationship is an ambivalent one, as it is with many African countries, because on the one hand, we criticize it justifiably for human rights abuses, suppression of minorities, suppression of the media,
being a laggard on democracy and so forth. I'm talking about Ethiopia, which on the other hand is a key strategic partner in the Horn of Africa as a center for regional stability, host of the African Union. At the same time, it's a laggard in terms of economic liberalization. The kinds of issues that we find across the board in Africa where we don't have a perfect relationship with hardly any country. We always have reasons to criticize a country. And I'm just wondering, since the theme today is transition in Africa, and Prime Minister Meles died a year and a half ago, and there's a new Prime Minister, as there are new leaders across Africa, how are we measuring progress in African countries generally, and specifically, are we looking or are we seeing progress in Ethiopia? Thank you.
I think that one has your name written on it.
Ambassador Hull has asked a very interesting question and an important one. Ethiopia, as you point out, is an extraordinarily important country in a strategic part of the world. And it's all the things that you've said and more. It's the second most populous country in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, after Nigeria. It has, like Nigeria, an enormous Muslim population that no one thinks about. In fact, there are more Muslims in Ethiopia than there are in Saudi Arabia or any of the Gulf states. It's, again, a very dynamic place. It has changed leaders in the last year. They lost Meles Zenawi, who was probably one of the most intellectually able and articulate leaders in Africa, and a slow mover towards democracy. The new Prime Minister, Haile Mariam Desalegn, is following in his footsteps. It is a democracy, but it is a democracy with weak institutions that are continuing to evolve. I think that it is important for us in the United States who believe firmly in democracy to continue to encourage them to strengthen their democratic institutions, to strengthen respect for the press and human rights, and to strengthen their parliament. And I think that it should be as much a part of our dialogue, our political dialogue with the Ethiopians, as some of the other issues that we deal with. We want them to liberalize their economy even more than they have, and they have done a lot of things. They could do a lot more. But I would also say that they've been pretty good security partners in a very tumultuous part of the world. They have been supportive in finding solutions in Somalia. They've been particularly valuable in providing peacekeepers in South Sudan and in Sudan writ large. And they have been cooperative in international organizations on key votes in the United Nations fora. But it is a complex country. I think that it is doing more that is positive than is negative, but there's certainly enormous room for continued improvement on the upside in terms of democratization and liberalization of the economy.
I would just second Ambassador Carson's point. They are a great security partner, very active in, as he said, in training and developing the South Sudanese forces in a positive direction. They're present in Abyei, a very contested, hotly contested area. And it's a very mature military-to-military relationship that we have with them. It's pretty much, it's at the graduate level. The senior Ethiopian officers that come to the United States to study, very accomplished. They don't rely much on us for military hardware or for basic levels of training. It's a very sophisticated, very mature relationship, and our friend General Samora is a tough guy and became one of my best friends. And because I liked him, he's very plain spoken. When he didn't like something we were doing, he was not hesitant to tell us about it. And he was very receptive when I would tell him things that we didn't like they were doing. So it was a good, mature relationship.
We are just about out of time, but I know a number of people still have questions. So what I'd like to do is gather 2 or 3, and we'll answer those and then call it a day. Yes. Okay, we have 1, 2, and 3, and 4. Here at Dartmouth, we're never allowed to leave a student hand up in the air. So.
Good afternoon. My name is Louis Greenstein. I'm Norman Miller's younger, smarter brother. My question is for Ambassador Carson. 7 challenges, but I didn't hear anything about health or education. And it seems to me that these belong on the list somewhere, and maybe you're seeing them as just a product of others on your list, but I would be grateful if you would say something about that.
Don't answer that yet. Okay. No, right next to. No, 2. There we go.
So this is a question sort of about terrorism. So terrorism in Northern Africa especially is very complex, and I was wondering from a policy-making perspective how you guys differentiate between traditional non-state actors and then the newer forms of terrorism. And also, this is sort of a broader question, which is self-interested because I'm writing an essay on this, but what sort of is the history of the term terrorism as applied to Northern Africa, and when did it start to be used, and how have you thought about, or how did policymakers think about when to apply it? So.
Orson St. John, I'm just wondering if you could speak to the corruption issue and tribal animosities and how that affects the development of good governance in Africa.
And then there was one right here.
Thank you. My name is Ben Levander. I'm a student here. So I've sort of related questions about Rwanda. So things have been relatively quiet there under Ambassador Symington. I forget who replaced him. And President Kagame has been sort of, I think he's done a very good job, but it's sort of a benevolent dictatorship. So where do you see the future of Rwanda heading? Where do you see the ability to strengthen democracy there and any sort of secession that might eventually happen? And then similarly, just on genocides in Africa in general, what factors do you look to when deciding whether the U.S. needs to get involved militarily or otherwise, and sort of what are the key things at play there? Thank you.
The simplest question last. Okay. When to intervene in a case of mass atrocities? Well, yeah. We may not get to that one. Johnnie, you want to start off and give a whack to all those that you can?
Yeah, let me just say that I didn't have health and education on my list of 7 as individual items, but the last thing that I mentioned as number 7 was the need to continue to grow the economies and to strengthen them. And under that large rubric, there is, I would put down a subset, continue to provide educational and health opportunities. There's no question in my mind that there has been an expansion of health and educational opportunities around Africa. It's been uneven from country to country, and in some places it's fallen back. But it is one of those things that is there under 0.7 of the years. I'm going to let General Ham answer the terrorism question, but I will say something about corruption. Corruption is one of the most corrosive cancers afflicting good governance across Africa. Nothing undermines a country more than corruption does. It takes away large amounts of precious budgetary money and foreign exchange away from education, from health, from roads and capital projects, and drives it into the hands of individuals who use it for their own personal interests and for their own personal greed. Corruption is a pernicious thing, and it is most pernicious in places where there's lots of money, and it's most pernicious in countries where there is little money and everything needs to be given to society. Tribal animosities continue to exist in some parts of Africa, but there is a tendency and a trend that is more positive across the continent in erasing ethnic and tribal differences these days, and I think there's been enormous improvement in this area as well. Rwanda and Paul Kagame. Rwanda is an extraordinary case study on many levels. On the first level, Rwanda is doing extraordinarily well, probably one of the best in utilizing foreign assistance in development aid. It's a model in what it does in technology, healthcare, and education. Really, really, really good job in all those areas domestically. It is also a very good, as General Ham would point out, strong peacekeeper. Their people do great peacekeeping work. On the domestic political side, there are questions starting to be raised, and people need to take heed of what is happening in Rwanda domestically under Paul Kagame's leadership. If you see the Washington Post this past Sunday, there was an op-ed in there about the recent death in South Africa of Rwanda's former intelligence chief. There have been some very disturbing reports and allegations made about the domestic politics of that country. So there's a lot out there. New York Times article in the magazine section about 2 months ago, also worth reading. Finally, the last one is the Eastern Congo. And there is a great concern there as well. There are strong indications that the Rwandans were supportive of the M23, who were engaged in South and North Kivus. So in a case like Ethiopia, it's not a clear and smooth record out there. Everybody appreciates enormously what's been done since the 1994 genocide, but we are now beyond that, and again, it's a much more complex political and economic picture taking shape there under Paul Kagame's leadership.
Okay, so you leave me with a couple of simple ones. With regard to the challenges of defining terrorism and identifying terrorism in North Africa, and when did it begin? Part of that is in the eyes of the beholder, but certainly from a U.S. perspective, it's been a long-standing issue. Libya as a source of terrorism certainly came to the National Front in the Lockerbie bombings and in Berlin, and we knew of all of those challenges. But from a North African standpoint, they would say like the GSPC certainly was terrorist organization. The French would say they were terrorists in Algeria long before that. From an American perspective, I think we focus more on organizations that seek to export the violence beyond a nation's borders, and that's when an organization starts to become of greater concern to the United States. So as AQIM grew out of GSPC, it started to get some attention, I think, in American intelligence circles, and then most certainly with operations in northern Mali, AQIM became a greater concern. It is exceedingly difficult sometimes to differentiate between a transnational terrorist organization and a more traditional group or body that has been longstanding. Again, Mali, I think, is instructive. We're longstanding Tuareg opposition to the government in Mali, probably not terrorist, at least from a U.S. perspective, but they found themselves, at least temporarily, aligned with AQIM, Ansar al-Sharia, and others because they had common purpose for at least for a short period of time. Once that common purpose had been achieved, then they tended to fracture a bit. So it is a real challenge to try to differentiate what are the groups that we really want to focus on that we think create the greatest threat to the United States. And it was one of the issues that Ambassador Benjamin and the broader intelligence counterterrorism community had to deal with. But it is a tough one. And then the simplest question for last, which is, when do you decide to intervene in potential mass atrocities or genocide? It's a highly complex question. Of course, for me, it played out most vividly in Libya, where I think the responsibility to protect ideology probably carried the day. We remember back to those days with a large Gaddafi regime force postured on the outskirts of Benghazi, a city of some 700,000, and words the world had heard before. We will hunt them down like rats. We will exterminate them. We will cleanse the city. I mean, the world has heard those words before. When you hear that intent espoused and you see a capability that is matched to carry out that intent, then the collective nations under the United Nations Security Council chose to act, and at least initially under a U.S.-led coalition. You can never prove the negative, but I believe in that instance it probably saved many thousands of lives. But it is an imprecise science, and certainly the United States is criticized for not acting in other circumstances. Libya was one of those where we had the wherewithal, we had international endorsement, we had imminent threat, and all those conditions came together and allowed us to act. The conditions won't always be that clear, and I think those are ultimately that's why presidents and heads of state get paid the big bucks, is to make those really, really hard decisions. It's frankly, it's easier on the military side simply to offer up here are the possibilities, here are the things we could do, because that's what the military does. We do what you could do, and then the policymakers, culminating with the president, have to decide what we should do. And those are two often very different and more difficult questions to answer.
Well, on that bit of insight and wisdom, I want to thank our two guests today, General Ham, Ambassador Carson. It's been fabulous to have you. We've gone 15 minutes late, and we have almost the entire audience we had when we started. And I think that's a testament to how good a presentation it's been.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was great.